One of the hardest things to do when you're investing at Fidelity is try to decipher which index funds could be best for your situation. So today, we're going to break down Fidelity's standard index funds versus their zero fee index funds. Now, Fidelity's zero funds consist of 4 different index funds, and these index funds do not have any fees. They have a 0% expense ratio. There is a catch to these, and it's that they don't track the proprietary indexes that most index funds will track. They actually have their own indexes that they compile together, and that is how they keep these fees expense ratio so low. And so, for example, instead of putting the name S&P 500 index on their fund, they have their own blend of Fidelity large cap stocks that is very, very similar to the S&P 500. And so of those zero fee index funds, they have 4 different ones that they offer. The first one is FZIPX, and FZIPX is their zero extended market index fund. So the closest comparison to this one would be like the Dow Jones Industrial Average, where they have 3,500 companies inside of this index fund. The second one is FZROX, and that's Fidelity's total stock market zero index fund. This is one where you can think of a total stock market index fund at Vanguard, and this is a very similar fund to that, where they track the entire stock market into this fund. Now, I've actually owned FZROX for the last couple of years. The third one is FZILX, which is Fidelity's international zero fund, and this one tracks all the different international investments. And the last one is FNILX, and this is Fidelity's zero large cap index fund. And this would be similar to the S&P 500 because the index that this tracks has 500 of the largest companies in the US. It just doesn't say S&P 500 because you have to pay to have that label on your fund, which is why they can reduce the costs of these funds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare these to the actual funds that track the actual indexes so that we can look at each one together. So the first battle is FNILX versus FXAIX, and this is Fidelity's large cap zero fund and is arguably the closest to its most comparable index fund of the S&P 500. So FXAIX is Fidelity's S&P 500 index fund. So first, let's dive into each one of these. So let's look at FNILX first. So as you can see here, FNILX has about $6.5 billion in assets. It's a large blend fund, and its yield is 1.30%. And it also has a turnover ratio of 3%. If you don't know what a turnover ratio is, it is where index funds buy and sell different securities. The higher that turnover ratio is, the more you pay in taxes. So you want that to be as low as possible. 3% is extremely low. Now, since this is very similar to the S&P 500, you're going to see very similar companies in the top 10 of FNILX. So inside of FNILX, the top 10 companies are Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, Alphabet Class A and Alphabet Class C, which is Google, Meta Platforms, Berkshire Hathaway, Tesla, and United Healthcare. Now let's look at the total returns over the last decade and see where it lands. So over the last decade, this will not have a ton of returns because it's only been around since 2019. But in 2019, it did 31.79%. In 2020, it did 21.12%. In 2021, it did 26.68%. In 2022, 19.36%. And then year to date in 2023, 19.03%. Now let's compare this to FXAIX. So FXAIX, as you can see here, has an expense ratio of 0.015%. So FNILX has a 0% expense ratio, and then FXAIX has a 1% expense ratio. And the yield is 1.50% with the same turnover ratio at 3%. So this is a fund with an extremely low expense ratio, and the differential between these two, like I said, is this one tracks the S&P 500. That's why they can call it the Fidelity 500 Index, or the FXAIX. This also has a longer track record than does the zero fee fund. So you can look at this and you can see it has a track record over the course of the last decade, where in 2013, 32%, 2014, 13.66%, 2015, 1.3%, 2016, 11.9%, and so on and so forth. In the last couple of years, in 2020, 18.4%, 2021, 28.69%, 2022, 18.13%, and then year to date, 18.41%. Now, the top 10 holdings here are going to be very similar. Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, Alphabet Class A, Alphabet Class C, Meta, which is Facebook, Berkshire Hathaway, Tesla, and United Healthcare. So between these two funds, they are extremely comparable. And the expense ratio is not going to make that massive of a difference. If you really hate the expense ratio, then you can go with the zero fee fund. But if you want the longer track record, then you can go with the Fidelity 500 fund that is going to allow you to have that long track record and maybe just a little more reassurance. Now, the next showdown is FZIPX versus FS Max. So FS Max tracks the Dow Jones US Total Stock Market Index. So you can think of this as every company outside of the S&P 500. So this covers more than 1,000 companies. It has minimal cost. So first, let's look at FZIPX. So FZIPX is Fidelity's Zero Extended Market Index. And in this fund, obviously it has a 0% expense ratio, and the yield is 1.51%. The turnover ratio is much higher than those 500 funds at 16%. And as you can see, these were started in 2019, so we don't have data for over a decade. In 2019, it did 26% rate of return, 16.59 in 2020. In 2021, it did 21.46%. 2022, negative 18%, and then year to date, 11.88%. Now, you're going to see very different top 10 holdings in these funds than you would in some of the S&P 500 funds, and a lot of these companies you probably have not heard of outside of a couple of these. So Builders First Source, Hubble Incorporated, First Citizens Bank, Ares Management Corp, Booz Allen Hamilton Holding Corp, Snap-on, a lot of people may know what Snap-on is from tools, Graco, which is the paint company, EQT Corp, and Deckers Outdoor Corp. So as we look through this one, not as many companies, and they're in very different sectors, where a lot of these are in industrial sectors. And so this is a very different type of company if you want to invest in these funds. Now let's look at FS Max, which does have an expense ratio. So FS Max has an expense ratio of 0.035%, and it has a yield of 1.31% and a turnover ratio that's even higher of 18%. Now this has a much longer track record over time, and it has had a bumpy road over the last decade. 38% in 2013, 7% in 2014, 2015 negative 3.29%, 2016 16.11%, and over the last 3 years, in 2021 12.41%, in 2022 negative 26.43%, and in year to date 15.99%. Now, the top 10 holdings in this fund are actually very different than the top 10 holdings that we are comparing to here with FZIPX. So these top 10 holdings are Uber, Palo Alto Networks, Blackstone, Marvel Technology, Snowflake Inc., Airbnb, Workday Inc., Lululemon Athletica, CrowdStrike, and others. And in this, you can see the different assets that they're holding in here, but these are the most comparable to the two. They have very similar goals, and they are the most comparable outside of the Fidelity Zero funds to the regular funds. All right, so the next two are FZROX and FSKAX, and these are the total market index funds that we are comparing here. So first, let's look at the zero fee one. The Fidelity Zero Total Market Index obviously has a 0% expense ratio. I like this one a lot. I own this one personally, and this has a yield of 1.35% and a turnover ratio of 3%. It's had great returns since 2019 when it started, 31.15% in 2019. In 2020, 20.50%. 2021 is 26%. 2022, negative 19% in that bear market. And year to date, 18.35% with some great top 10 holdings on this one. So Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, Alphabet Class A and C, Meta Platforms, Berkshire Hathaway, Tesla, and United Healthcare Group. So it's very similar to the S&P 500. Those large companies hold a large weight in all U.S. portfolios. And then you can compare this to FSKAX. So FSKAX has had an expense ratio of 0.015% with a yield of 1.43% and then a 2% turnover ratio. So a lower turnover ratio on this one. And the total return over time, we'll just look from 2019 on, 30%, 20%, 25%, and 18%. So in that scenario, the zero fee fund actually outperformed it slightly over the course of those last few years. Now, the top 10 holdings are going to be exactly the same: Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, Alphabet Class A and C, Facebook, Berkshire Hathaway, Tesla, and United Healthcare Group. And the last showdown we're going to do are the international indexes. So between these international indexes, we have FZILX versus FTIHX, and these are the international funds. So let's first look at the zero fund, Fidelity Zero International Index, FZILX. And this has obviously a 0% expense ratio with a 2.4% dividend yield, which is a much higher yield than all these other funds we've looked at so far, and a turnover ratio at 6%. But as we know, international funds have underperformed lately, and so the returns are going to be a little lower. So 21.67% in 19, in 20, 11.05%, 2021, 8.21%, and in 2022, negative 15.95%. So year to date, we are at 12.95%. And the top 10 holdings here are going to be companies that some of these you may have heard of and some you may have not. So in the FZILX, the zero fund, they actually have Fidelity Reserve there, MSCI, Taiwan Semiconductor, Nestle, ASML Holdings, Samsung, Novo Nordisk, and a couple of others, LVMH, which is Louis Vuitton, and some of the luxury brands there. Now, in the total international index, FTIHX, they have an expense ratio of 0.06%. So that this has the largest gap differential, and dividend yield of 2.3% and turnover ratio of 3%. So over time, you can see the returns on this, where the returns are going to be very, very similar over the last 4 years. So 21.48% in 19, 11.07% in 20, 8.47% in 21, negative 16.28 in 22, and then year to date 12.3%. And then if you look at the top 10 holdings, they're going to be very similar. Taiwan Semiconductor, Nestle, ASML Holdings, Novo Nordisk, Samsung, Tencent, and then LVMH are all holding inside of this one as well. So as you're going through these and as you're doing your research for some of these index funds, the thing to consider here is what is the gap between the expense ratio and how much is this going to impact me based on the dollar amount that I think I'm going to have in these funds. If you think it's going to be thousands and thousands of dollars every single year, maybe you consider the zero fee index funds and you do more research on those. But if you think it's going to be less than that, then maybe you consider the fee funds because they have a longer track record until the zero funds have those track records. So for me personally, I would prefer the longer track record because they actually follow the index that we know which index are supposed to be following. I don't like that the zero fee funds only follow a proprietary index that they have instead of actually utilizing the index that all the other funds follow. So that is how they give you a 0% expense ratio. And for me, those are my final thoughts is I'd rather have the track record. And then over time, maybe I switch over to the zero fee funds as I approach retirement age if I want to lower some of those expense ratios when we get there. So that is the thought process for me on this, but let me know what you think down in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and we will see you on the next video.